We're really grateful for this opportunity that came together fairly quickly to have Todd Compton come and join us tonight. For those of you that may or may not know, this is actually Todd's third event at our store, and so we're pretty excited. I was talking to him about there should be some kind of special reward for an author that has written 3 books that are worthy of benchmark book events, and we appreciate him coming from California to be here. We appreciate Signature Books for their sponsorship and publishing of this book, and thank you, Barbara Brown, for being here tonight.
Chris,
let's see if anybody else is.
I have a question. Was anyone here when we did the event for the first book? Out of curiosity?
Okay. Former Signature Books.
I was curious.
That was 1997, so been a few years. In the meantime, Todd has published several other books that are noteworthy that I'd point out to you. From 𝘮𝘯 Books, he annotated Leland Gentry's master's thesis on the history of the Latter-day Saints in northern Missouri called Fire and Sword. If you're interested in the history of the church in Missouri, this is one of the best references ever done. He received the Juanita Brooks Prize in Mormon Studies for his biography of Jacob Hamblin called A Frontier Life. Jacob Hamblin, explorer and Indian missionary. If that's something you'd be interested in, we have copies of that as well. One of the books that he helped to edit from the Utah State University Press's Life Writings of Frontier Women, called A Widow's Tale, is out of print, and I don't have a single copy to show you, but that's another monumental book of Todd's. He was also involved in the editing of one of Hugh Nibley's volumes, right? Mormonism and Early Christianity. So if you have that in your library, you know Todd had his imprint there. He's written several non-Mormon books on the Beatles and one on ghost stories, right? I think.
It's true.
So,
very good. Not many people know about
a couple of very varied interests and well-written books. And in fact, one of our customers tonight had one of his Beatles books to show us, so that was pretty cool. Anyway, really grateful for Todd to be here. And did I miss any others? I'm sorry. Was there?
No.
That was the major. That's pretty accomplished.
I'm amazed you got that many.
That's pretty accomplished, and we really appreciate being here and being a part of that. A couple other things for those of you that haven't been here before. There are bathrooms here on this floor down the hall, and you have to do a code to get in the door. It's 254 if you need to use the bathroom at any time. If you wouldn't mind turning off your phones at this point so we don't have any interruptions. These proceedings will be recorded. We will post this on our website and on YouTube within a few days if you want to watch this again or if you want to suggest to other people to watch it. Brian, you mind grabbing a couple more chairs and put them over here? A couple of things to look forward to in the near future. Unfortunately, I don't have exact dates, but Tom Wayment has published a new edition of his translation of the New Testament that was first published by the Religious Study Center. 𝘮𝘯 Books is publishing a new edition that will be out in the next couple of weeks, and we hope to have Tom here the first part of November. And then the University of Utah is publishing a book called Open Canon, edited by Christopher Blythe, and it's a collection of scriptural accounts and references of the many different groups of the Restoration, some early, some more modern. That should be very interesting. There's a host of contributors to that. Anybody here that's involved in that project by chance? Well, we'll hopefully have them here in November as well. And then in December, there'll be an exhaustive treatment of it's called Slavery in Zion, also from the University of Utah Press, coming out. Barbara, anything from Signature before the end of the year?
Oh, lots.
That's going to be out?
Yes.
Okay.
We have Michael Hicks, Wineskin, Freaking Jesus in the 60s and 70s.
Okay,
That's coming out very soon.
so Michael Hicks, a longtime professor at BYU's kind of personal memoirs of his 70s time period.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And then also Benjamin Parks edited
Oh.
anthology of essays on the life and legacy of D. Michael Quinn is coming out.
If you couldn't hear that, it's Ben Parks' anthology of essays that were given at a conference in honor of Michael Quinn last year, right? Anthology.
No, this March.
Oh, it was this year? Wow, that's quick. Speaking of signature books, another that just came out from them is in their short biography series on Martha Hughes Cannon. Very nice little brief biography by Constance Lieber. And the last event that we had prior to this one for Method Infinite Freemasonry and the Mormon Restoration by Cheryl Bruno, Joe Swick, and Nicholas Lattersky. Very, very interesting history. If you're interested in Freemasonry, it's a must-have in your library. And the hard copies are nearly sold out. They have less than 100 copies available. So, a couple of plugs there for a few things. Also, this one that Brian here was the publisher for, and Gary Bergera, the compiler, Justice and Mercy, Studies of Transgression in the Latter-day Saint Community. Many of you were here for an event for that as well. So anyway, a couple things to point out. Okay, without further ado, any questions before we get going or comments here? So basically what we'll do is we'll turn the time over to Todd. He'll give us his presentation and some readings, and then we'll do a questions and answers. There will be some refreshments out in the hallway to enjoy afterwards. And we'd love you to come up and get your book signed or inscribed by Todd after we're done with everything. And we really appreciate you being here, and hopefully you'll come out and see us more in the future. With that, I'll turn it over to Todd. Do you want this lectern? You want to just...
Readings.
Yeah, when the people do the readings, maybe.
Okay.
But
We'll just
I guess
leave it
I
back
don't need
there.
it now.
You mind if I pin this on?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, great to see you all here. A lot of people I have known for a while, and some people who are new to me. So I think all of you are probably really interesting people. It would be great to take a half an hour to talk to each of you, but I don't know if Chris will keep the store open that late. But at least I've got to talk to some of you just a little bit so far. Okay, just a couple little bullet points that are kind of my sales point while I'm thinking about them. I've been talking to a lot of people who have written me and said, Todd, you know, I've loaned my copy of In Sacred Loneliness out, and they're not giving it back to me. What should I do? Okay, what's the obvious answer? Buy 2 copies. So, the other thing is the price of this book. I have friends who are publishing books, often with university presses, and the books are, you know, they're charging like $125 for them. And so this book is, for an 800-page book, it's only, what is it, $39.95? And so it's, you know,
Not bad.
I'm not sure how Signature can afford to do that, but
We want it to be accessible.
so anyway, okay, I was just going to tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book. And to do that, as this is a sequel, I will have to go back even further and tell you how I wrote the first book, In Sacred Loneliness. And The Plural Lives of Joseph Smith, that's the first book. And the second book, In Sacred Loneliness, The Documents. And the funny story about that is that when I was in the editing process with Signature, and I had no idea what I was going to title this book. And so the working title I gave it is In Sacred Loneliness, The Documents. And in every email I sent to Gary Bergera, I'd say, have you given any thought to what we should have as the title for this? And then the catalog came out and there was the book, and the title was In Sacred Loneliness, the Documents. So I guess he thought that was an okay title. I kind of wrote this in a strange way. And do you have a copy of Joe Geisner's book handy? Could you lift it up? And so you can see. What happened was my friend Joe Geisner, he edited a book with signature called Writing Mormon History. And he went to a number of historians and asked them to write an essay about how they had written one of their books.
Yeah, right.
And so he asked me to write one of these, so I said, okay. And as I was going ahead and as I was writing it, and I was doing it just obviously at first from memory, but then I thought, you know, I ought to look and see if I have any documents I could find. So I went back into my physical, you know, documents that relate to this period in my history, writing the book and editing the book. And so I found physical documents like letters I'd written, but I found a lot of stuff on my computer, letters I'd written. And but as I was doing this, as I was going back through my folders within folders within folders on my computer, I found the transcriptions I'd made of these women's writings long ago when I was just starting to do the work in Sacred Loneliness. And way back then, and we're talking about 93 or 94, the internet was in its infancy, and you didn't have primary sources on the internet. You didn't even have the Deseret News on the internet. And if I wanted to read the Deseret News, I found it at the Huntington Library, and I was thrilled that I could go put it on a roller and read it on the screen. And so what you had to do is you had to go to a whole bunch of libraries and just do transcriptions of the documents you needed and type them on your laptop. And if it was a short document, a fairly short document, you could make a transcript of the whole thing. And then you'd have it at home when you're writing the chapter on that woman. You could actually refer to that primary document as you're writing the chapter. And if it was a letter, you could transcribe the whole thing. If it was a autobiography, often you could transcribe the whole thing, unless it was like 200 pages, but mostly they were like 30 or 40 pages. And so that was a task that I kind of enjoyed when I was at the archives doing these transcriptions. And I remember when I was stuck on a word, because often, as you who've read Pioneer Diaries know, sometimes their handwriting was terrible, their spelling was terrible, and you just had no idea what the word was. I remember I would go to, there was a nice lady who would give us our documents, and she had worked on reading documents relating to crossing the plains. And so I'd say, I'm stuck on this word, could you come look at it? She'd come look at it, and often she would figure out what it was. And so it was a fun process, transcribing these documents. And so as I'm writing the article in Writing Mormon History, I came across these documents, and I thought, you know, I've always thought that these documents should be published. Some of them are really important documents, and some of them are really moving, wonderful documents, and it would be great to publish them in a book. And I'd been thinking about this on and off through the years, and as you know, often what happens is you just forget about that idea. But I ran it past Gary, who's in the back there, and Gary liked the idea. So I began collecting these transcriptions I'd made, and I found out that what I often needed to do is I often needed to check them, but now it's the time of the internet when we have primary documents on the internet. which is a great change from when I started the first book. And the LDS, Church History Library and Archives, has done a wonderful job of putting lots of documents up on their website so you can read them, the autograph that the woman actually wrote. And so I wrote most of this book. I worked on this book during COVID, and I could do a lot of my work of checking on these documents on the internet. And so that is, I think, this is the first book in the history of literature that was created when I was explaining how a different book was written. It was Joe having me write that essay that brought this book into being. And I wrote introductions to each chapter, and I wrote an introduction to the whole book, and I wrote lots of notes where I identified people, and I identified if I felt something needed an explanation. I did research and tried to do the explanation. And for instance, for the Eliza R. Snow diaries, I included her diaries when she was in early Salt Lake City, and I really found out a lot about that period of Mormon history. And so I really enjoyed that part of working on my book. Okay, and I added some appendices that I think should be very useful to people. There's one has the plural wives of Brigham Young, another has the plural wives of Heber C. Kimball, and these were footnoted, documented. So I think they'll be really useful. And so, okay, let's go back to when I was starting to write In Sacred Loneliness. And you can read the whole story in Joe's book, in the essay I wrote in Joe's book. But what happened was, by a weird series of events, one of my friends encouraged me to apply to the Huntington Library, which is in Los Angeles, where I was living. It's kind of in the Pasadena area. She encouraged me to apply to work on the diaries of Eliza R. Snow. And I could have just said no, or I could have just politely not done anything about it. But she wrote this nice letter and talked about it and how easy it would be for me to apply, and she even wrote some things I could put in the application. And I thought, this doesn't look like it would be too much work. I won't get this, because I had no background in Mormon history. All my background was in the ancient world, ancient Greek and Rome. But I went through the process, and I applied to the Huntington to work on Eliza R. Snow with no background or no qualifications at all. And ever since that day, I've applied to many things with great qualifications, and they denied me, turned me down flat. And this is the other side of the question, the other side of the issue. I applied for something with no qualifications at all, and to my surprise, I had totally forgotten that I'd applied. To my surprise, I got a letter in the mail and it said I had received this fellowship to work at the Huntington Library, to go to the Huntington Library, which is has beautiful gardens, wonderful library, wonderful Mormon collection, and it had the trail diaries of Eliza R. Snow. So I got, they were paying me to go there every day and do Mormon history. So I said, okay, I'll work on Mormon history if you'll pay me to go to the Huntington. And so I started to work on those Eliza R. Snow diaries. And I got interested in, again, I was trying to annotate them. which is explain who each of the people were who were in her diaries and get their name and a little bit about their history. And I felt like I needed to have a good list of Eliza R. Snow's sister wives in the Joseph Smith family. She was a plural wife of Joseph Smith. So I needed a list of Joseph Smith's wives. And I felt like I had pretty good lists of Brigham Young's wives and Heber C. Kimball's wives. But I couldn't find a good scholarly footnoted list of Joseph Smith's wives. So I started making my own list, and I started writing these little biographies, that I at first thought would be just 2 or 3 sentences each. But I found out it was challenging to figure out the lives of these women, and often they had really complex marriage history. They had married 3 or 4 men, and every time, of course, they get married, they change their name. And so in diaries, and a woman might be known during her first marriage, let's say in 1833, might be known as Sister Goldsmith, and later she was known as Sister Brackenbury, and then in Nauvoo she's known as Sister Durfee. And this, of course, is Elizabeth Davis. Let's see if I can do those names again. Goldsmith, Brackenbury, Durfee. Then she married Joseph Smith, and then I think she married Cornelius Lott too. So I found it was a challenge to identify the women in Eliza R. Snow's diary, and it was a fun challenge, And there's this wonderful detective element of history, of getting a problem and trying to track down the sources that tell the story of the problem. And so that was a really fun thing for me to do when I started working on Eliza R. Snow. However, as I began working on these little diaries, I found out that, the Huntington has the diaries of Eliza Maria Partridge Smith Lyman, who was one of Joseph Smith's plural wives. And so I was at the Huntington. They were paying me to go there and just read and write and do research. And so I sat down again, it was on microfilm, and read her diary on microfilm. And it was a wonderful diary. And of course it helped me with the small biography I'd written. But I found out the small biography was becoming a larger biography. And because it was kind of a long diary, all I could do was take notes. I couldn't transcribe the whole diary, but I took notes at the important parts. And it's a very moving diary. And there's a lot of events that are very, very memorable and moving, like the death of her daughter. She tells in great detail, and she was a fine writer. And so that kind of changed, it kind of changed my research from starting, as a fun detective project. It stayed that way, but it also added this emotional element to my research and my interests. And so as things turned out, I got obsessed, and it, really changed my whole life, and I went in a totally different direction that wasn't in line with what I should have done to get a job in classics. And eventually, I didn't know what was going to happen, but eventually it became a book. Okay, so now we can move back to the new book, In Sacred Loneliness, the Documents. So I had all these documents transcribed on my computer. So all I needed to do was collect them and check them. If there's a word I didn't understand still, I could often check it on the internet and write introductions and so on. And so the same elements that I first experienced when I read Eliza Partridge's diary are preserved in this new book. Those documents that moved me so much. Another one is the letters written by Louisa Beeman Smith Young. And she was the first wife of Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. And so she's an important historical figure. And so one day I sat down, I went to the catalog at the Church History Library and typed in the names that might bring up Louisa Beeman. And I typed them in, and she came up, and she had written some letters. So I ordered them, and again, I sat at the microfilm reader and read the letters she'd written in her own hand. And they were very moving letters. And she had a tragic life in many ways. After Joseph Smith died, she married Brigham Young and first had a pair of twins kind of around the late Nauvoo era. And these twins died. And then at winter quarters, she had another child with Brigham Young named Moroni. And he died in winter quarters, so she'd lost 3 kids. So she was crossing the plains and had another pair of twins who were twins with Brigham Young, as she had with Brigham Young. And so she brought them along to Salt Lake City, to early Salt Lake City. And, I don't want to take away from that's going to be one of the readings. But her kids, these last 2 kids died in early Salt Lake City. And one of the readings we have will be from Louisa Beeman's letter. And so, again, it was really an emotional experience for me. It's a wonderful letter that she wrote. So, in the first book, I had generous quotes from these women. And so I think the beauty of their writing did come through. And that's one of the reasons it's continued to have a readership through the years, I believe. However, in the new book, In Sacred Loneliness, the Documents, all of these shorter documents are there complete. And it's really a great thing to actually read the complete document. And Louisa Beeman, after she'd told her sister wife, Miranda Hyde, Miranda Johnson Hyde Smith, about the death of her children, she went on and talked about what life was like in early Salt Lake City. And again, as I told you, that was one of my interests. And so it's a great document from that period of history. So that's one of the reasons it's great to have the whole document. Another is, if you're reading something about a controversial subject and the author quotes from a document, it's a good idea to go back and check what the author quoted and to check what's immediately before and immediately after the quote. Okay, so I think people have agreed there are some things in my first book that were found to be controversial. And so in the second book, the documents, often you have the full document. And it's nice to be able to go back and read that quote in context. And so I'm thinking of maybe the Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner Smith Young memoir. And she was one of the polyandrous wives of Joseph Smith. She married Joseph Smith while she was married to another man. And in her diary, in her memoir, she has a record of how Joseph Smith proposed to her. So that's really an important historical record, because we don't have that kind of record from these polyandrous wives. They often didn't specifically write about their marriage to Joseph Smith. And here we have Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner writing about it in her memoir. And by the way, this is an example of how it's good to, again, go back to the primary source, read the document if you can, as written by the woman, because her autobiography has been published in typescripts in a number of places. And it's always worth looking at these typescripts, but when I have a typescript, my ambition is always, okay, is there an autograph where the person herself has written this? And so one day I was at the Utah State Historical Society archives and looked in the catalog again, and there was an autobiography by Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, and to my excitement, it was written in her hand. And in the typescripts, that part about the proposal from Joseph Smith was edited out. And often families do, family historians do this. If there's something that they think should be kept with the family, they edit it out. And so it was great to see her autobiography in her own hand and to read that again. And in the new book, documents, I have the whole memoir, and she was a great storyteller. And I don't know if we'll have time to read something by her today, but she told stories really well, and she knew Joseph Smith. She was there in Kirtland, Independence, Nauvoo, and so it's great to have that. It's an important document. It's great to have the whole thing available. And so I think that is a good introduction to the new book. And now I would like to have some friends and family help read some of the passages from this book. And so I think we will start with 𝘠𝘠 𝘠𝘠, and my sister Tina will help with that. And she's coming around here. So, let's see, how should we do this? How should we do the readers? Should we switch this?
Maybe just, so everyone can hear.
I'm not sure how to do it. Could you come and help? Oh, okay. Okay, this is the letter by 𝘠𝘠 𝘠𝘠, that she wrote fairly soon after she came to Salt Lake City.
I'm led to think at times there's not much else but sorrow and affliction in this world for me. The next day after I arrived in the valley, my babes were both taken sick with the bowel complaint. The canker set in, and on the 11th of October, I was called upon to give up the oldest one, and his little spirit took its flight to join with his brothers and Father in heaven. My anxiety was all turned towards the other one that was living. The next day after this one was buried, the other commenced to get better. He got so that he seemed well and grew fleshy, as fast as I ever saw a child, and I even dared to hope that I should raise him. But I no sooner hoped than my hopes were all blasted one day, all in a moment, as it were. He was taken down again with the same complaint, and all I could do, both by faith and works, did not seem to do any good. And on the 16th of November, he breathed his last, and I was again left alone. You that have been mothers and lost children can better imagine my feelings than I can describe them. I have fondly hoped that I should raise them. They looked very much alike indeed. Their eyes were of just a color. I called them Alva and Alma, but they are gone. And I must be reconciled to the will of God, and I desire ever to acknowledge His hand in all things. I look forward to the time when I shall again behold them and clasp them to my bosom. Will not my soul be joyful? I feel as though it would. I desire to bear all of my afflictions with patience, realizing that my Heavenly Father knows better what is for my good than myself. And I feel to submit all things in His hands and say, His will be done, and not mine.
Okay, I was on a podcast not long ago and I tried to read that myself and I kind of broke down. It was really embarrassing. Okay, and next I would like to have...
Gary, what year was that? Was that 48 or 47?
what was it? I think it was 1852.
Oh, 52.
Yeah. I'd have to check. Okay. Barbara Brown is going to read two passages that give two different views of polygamy.
What do you want first?
Let's give 𝘠𝘠 𝘠𝘠 first. 𝘠𝘠 𝘠𝘠 is the pen name of this woman. She was the daughter of Don Carlos Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, and Agnes 𝘠𝘠. And Agnes 𝘠𝘠 was a wife of Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. And she called her Josephine as daughter, and she eventually remarried someone named Pickett, and they moved to California, were kind of part of the gold rush. And 𝘠𝘠 𝘠𝘠 was living in Los Angeles. And so as she was living in Los Angeles, she would write letters to her cousin, Joseph F. Smith. And 𝘠𝘠 was 16 and Joseph was 18. And after that, I wanted to give, it's kind of a negative view of polygamy, but then I wanted to give a positive view, and in a meeting that was a defense of the ladies of Utah of polygamy, Eliza Partridge, who I've mentioned earlier, gave a talk, and so there's an excerpt from the talk. Okay, let me...
Do you have all of the...
Readings? No.
Yeah, I should have brought them. Okay, no, not that much. I just want to put a little bit about polygamy. Yeah. There was one section. Okay, read this paragraph here.
Okay. So again, this is her writing to her cousin Joseph F. Smith. They're both teenagers at the time. She writes, "Is it right for a girl of 15 and even 16 to marry a man of 50 or 60? Can there be any love there? And has not God willed a woman to love, honor, and obey her husband? And can it be right thus to pledge false vows at the altar in perfect mockery of all that is good and pure in God's most holy laws? I think I see myself vowing to love and honor some old driveling idiot of 60. I'm laughing because I'm getting close to 60. To be taken into his harem and enjoy the pleasure of being his favorite sultana for an hour, and then thrown aside whilst my godly husband is out sparking another girl in hopes of getting another victim to his despotic power. Pleasant prospect, I must say. And this, Joe, this is of God, is it? No, never, never, never. You may preach, you may talk to me from now to eternity, but you never will make me believe that polygamy is true. We'll stop there.
It kind of makes you wonder how she got that attitude toward polygamy, doesn't it? Okay. Okay, let me find it for you quick.
So while Todd's finding that, so 𝘐𝘯 became kind of a celebrated poet in California, and one of her admirers was Mark Twain. So she went on to national fame and prominence.
Okay, why don't you start right there and go down to the bottom of the page. Right there. Oh, what the heck? You start right here and go to the end.
Okay. So this is Eliza Partridge.
Eliza Partridge.
She and her sister were sealed to Joseph when they were teenagers. It is now about 31 years since the prophet Joseph taught to me the principles of celestial marriage. I was then married by that order and have raised a family of both sons and daughters in what is called polygamy. And I am not afraid to say that it is one of the most pure and holy principles that has ever been revealed to the Latter-day Saints, and one that is necessary to our exaltation. The anti-polygamists say the laws of celestial marriage are a curse to our children. Will they be kind enough to tell us where it is any disadvantage to them? We are not afraid to compare our children with those born and raised in monogamy. Perhaps they do not know that the Lord reserved some of the most noble spirits to come forth in the last days to perform the great work which he has begun on earth and which he will consummate in spite of all opposing influences. Then let us rejoice, my sisters, that we are numbered with the people of God, that we have embraced the celestial order of marriage, and happy shall we be in a coming day if we have never spoken lightly of sacred things. As an American citizen, I offer my most fervent protest against the unhallowed crusade and firmly believe that Congress has no right to enact laws interfering with our religious liberty. Every person should have the privilege of serving God according to the dictates of their own conscience, and as loyal citizens of these United States, we claim that privilege. This was in January 1879.
Okay, so you have two kind of different views of polygamy there, don't you? 𝘐𝘯 and Eliza Partridge. Okay, Tammy, did I assign Emily Partridge?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, so Emily Partridge, Smith Young, and her sister Eliza, who we first heard from, lived in the Joseph Smith house, and they kind of acted as nannies, and they married Joseph Smith, and they were both fine writers. And Emily Partridge wrote kind of a memoir of when she was a child, and it's kind of like, I call it the remembrance of past of Mormon history. It's really a delightful description of her when she was a little girl. And then she wrote a really fine memoir of her marriage to Joseph Smith. And later in her life, she wrote a very full diary of when she was married to Brigham Young, and that is also a really fascinating document, because she had difficulties in that family. And so I forget which of those things I've assigned you to read, but we'll find out. This is my sister, Tammy.
The same ones?
Well, how much time do we have left? Yeah.
This is when she got married, and then this is when she was lamenting her life.
Those are all so good. It's really hard to cut any of those out. This is just a paragraph, isn't it? Yeah.
Let's just go for it.
Okay, go ahead.
I remember the delicious clingstone peaches that grew near the back of the house, the cherry tree that stood in the corner of the lot, and the large weeping willow near the shop. There was a flat embankment running the whole length of the back of the house, and a frame covered with grapevines, both shading the house and making a nice shady place for the children to play, and we took possession of it. Not that we played there all the time by any means, for we were like gypsies, roaming around from one place to another, and we were not stinted for room, as some children are in large cities. Not far from the house, next to the street, was Father's hat store, and how I used to rummage under the counter, child fashion, looking for treasures such as bits of red, blue, green, and gilt leathers, such as are used to line hats and boys' caps. And oh, how I would sometimes bump my head when I would raise up, and how I would cry. But with all the abundance of playground that we had, it seems that I was not satisfied, for I would run away to the neighbors, and then I would be brought back and tied up to Mother's bedstead with a long rope that would allow me to reach to the sitting room. I used to cry a little and would soon forget all about it until I would start up again to run away, and the rope would stop me, and another cry. But they could not keep me tied up always, so I would be off again. And once when I was out in the street, a pet lamb of one of the neighbors took after me, and I really thought it would devour me if I let him overtake me, but I beat him running and got home first. Now we're skipping ahead to the time when she got married to Joseph Smith. Mrs. Durfee came to me one day and said Joseph would like an opportunity to talk with me. I asked her if she knew what he wanted. She said she thought he wanted me for a wife. I think I was thoroughly prepared for almost anything. I was to meet him in the evening at Brother Kimball's. I had been helping with the wash all day, and I was so afraid somebody would mistrust where I was going that I dare not change my wash dress. So I threw a large cloak over me and said I was going to run over to see Mother, which I did, but didn't stay long, and started out as if going back, but went to the place appointed instead. When I got there, nobody was at home but William and Helen Kimball. I don't know what they thought to see me there at that hour. I did not wait long before Brother Kimball and Joseph came in. Brother Heber told his children they had better go in to one of the neighbors, as there would be a council that evening at their house, and said to me, "The lad is not at home, and you had better call another time." So I started out with William and Helen and bid them goodbye. I started for home as fast as I could, so as to get beyond being called back, for I still dreaded the interview. However, I soon heard Brother Kimball call, "Emily, Emily," rather low, but loud enough for me to hear. I thought at first I would not go back, and took no notice of his calling, but he kept calling and was about to overtake me, so I stopped and went back with him. I cannot tell all Joseph said, but he said the Lord had commanded him to enter into plural marriage and had given me to him. And although I had got badly frightened, he knew I would yet have him, and he waited until the Lord told him. My mind was now prepared and would receive the principles. I do not think if I had not gone through the ordeal I did, that I would ever have gone off at night to meet him. But that was the only way that it could be done then. Well, I was married there and then. Joseph went home his way, and I going my way alone. A strange way of getting married, wasn't it? Brother Kimball married us the 4th of March, 1843. And then this is a funny incident that happened. Thursday the 3rd, attended our Relief Society meeting. Just before we commenced, the bishop and first counselor came in. After we had got through with the business of the meeting, Bishop Piper arose and said he came in to say a few words to the sisters on behalf of the trustees of the schoolhouse. They wanted to manage the affairs of the house, and he would be glad if the sisters would please not interfere. He repeated it the same several times in the course of his remarks and wound up by saying he was too mad to talk, and sat down. Now I was not a bit pleased with his remarks, because I did not think the sisters merited the rebuke. All they have done in that direction was because the bishop told our president, Sister Staines, he would throw that job onto the sisters. My heart rebelled at it as soon as I heard of it, and I think the rest of the sisters felt the same. Then to have him say or intimate that we were meddling with his affairs, I thought it an insult, and more so coming from him. Why cannot our rulers be kind and considerate to the members of the ward? It seems that some men think that because we are women, that they are justified in kicking us right and left. We don't want to interfere with his business. We have enough to do of our own. And we would rather have our labors lightened than to have more laid upon us. Yet we are willing to do all we can in performing the duties of the ward that belong to us as members of the Relief Society. I came home from the meeting with a severe headache. And her final thoughts about her life in this passage. July 29th, 1881, Sunday. Today I've been thinking. My mind goes back to days gone by, and what do I find? Can I find anything so pleasant that I would wish to live it over again, or even to dwell upon it in thought, with any degree of satisfaction? No, I cannot. My life has been like a panorama of disagreeable pictures. As I scan them over one by one, they bring no joy, and I invariably wind up with tears. I have been heart-hungry all my life, always hoping against hope, until the years are nearly spent, and hope is dead for this life, but bright for the next. And then I ask myself, what great or good thing have I done that I should hope for better things in the next world? Or what great trial or exploit can I recount, like many others, perhaps, that will bring honor and greatness? I can only sum it up in one word, and that is, I am a woman, or if that is not enough, I am a mother, and still more, I am, as the world calls it, a spiritual wife. Of early days, when public opinion was like an avalanche, bearing all such beneath its oppressive weight, some will understand what it is to be a woman, mother, or an unloved spiritual wife. August 1st. Yesterday I was in a dark mood. Today I am looking for the bright spots. Although they may be few and far between, they should not be overlooked. And among my greatest blessings, I class the facts that I am a mother and was a spiritual wife.
Okay, thank you for all these readers. You did a great job. And before I stop, I should say this coming to Benchmark, when a book has been published, has lots of good memories for me and a lot of good memories of Kurt Bench. And so he was really encouraged good Mormon history, so I'm really thankful for him. And thanks for Chris for continuing it on. And so I guess that's all for now. Oh, question and answer, sure. Question and answers, sorry. Does anyone have a question that will totally stump me? Yeah, Brad.
Ron Esplin, I think probably 20 years ago, right after you published your book, approached BYU Special Collections when I was chair there and said, I'd like to have you work with Todd to see if we could get all his records from his book, Sacred Loneliness. Do you remember talking to Ron and how he at the time, everyone was so anxious to get all the records, all the primary sources that you had put together so beautifully in this book? Do you have any recollection of that?
No, I don't think it ever got to the point where he contacted me. I don't have any remembrances of that. I think I remembered you. You were interested in it, and we talked about it a little, but it never quite happened.
They specifically called me out from the church history department and said, we think that it would be possible to be acquired for BYU. Will you approach you? And I cold called you with this idea. In any case, I'm very pleased to see all this in a very accessible form.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I still have a lot of documents. I think I didn't want to give anything back at that point because I was still working on things, you know. But at some point I will have to give my papers to some archives someplace. It's kind of hard to decide what do I want to keep and what should go to the archives. It's almost like you have to make, unless you die and just leave it, you know. You know, it's hard to make the choice what should go to what place.
Your profession, when you first got interested in all this and it began to dominate your time, tell us a little about it yourself, your history.
Oh yeah. The question was, what was my profession when I started researching in sacred loneliness and became obsessed, and it destroyed my, my career in other paths. When I was thinking about writing the article for Joe Geisner's book, what was the title of that I came up with finally? I forget, but one of my possible titles was The Blessings of Failure. Because my life had not gone the way I hoped and planned it to go. And I had hoped to get a decent job teaching Greek and Latin. And that didn't work out. And after you've, gotten a PhD and taught a little bit, and you can't continue with that career, it's really, really difficult. So that's one of the reasons that I applied for this fellowship and accepted it. So what was my profession? During most of when I wrote in Sacred Loneliness, I worked as a temp, and I would do office jobs. I remember I worked for a while in a real estate management office, and something I was totally unsuited for. And for a while I worked in a kind of a stockbroker's office where I would help to record the deals that were being made in the next room. And so I would work in a job like this, and then it would come time where I felt like I needed to go to Salt Lake and spend another month in the archives. So because it was a temp job, I could just stop and go on up to Salt Lake City and stay at my sister's houses. Thank you, Tammy and Tina. And so that's how I kind of financially supported writing in Sacred Loneliness. I wasn't married at the time, I didn't have kids. And later I got a job in a law office, and so that's when I first got the luxury of having health insurance and a steady job. But because of that, I didn't feel like I had as much freedom to go to different archives and do research like I did when I was doing In Sacred Loneliness. So the blessings of failure, if I hadn't been in that position where I didn't have a real solid job career awaiting me, I never would have written the book. And I never would have got obsessed, wonderfully obsessed, doing that wonderful detective work and experiencing the wonderful diaries of Eliza R. Snow and people like her. So that's how our life is sometimes. Things don't go as they planned, and sometimes it leads you in other directions that are worthwhile, I guess. There's my profound thought for the day. Yes?
I'm sure you have deep respect and love for all of these women that you've researched. But if you could wave a magic wand and meet three of them, say three of them are outside that door right now, who comes to mind? Top three. I don't want to say the top three because they're all beautiful women, but who would be outside that door for you to talk to?
Probably some of the women we just heard their words. Emily Partridge was a fine writer, full of humor, and yet she was very, she could really write frankly about the failings of some of the people who were close to her, like her husband, Brigham Young, and this bishop. At the same time, she was, had a really deep testimony. So definitely Emily Partridge, and her sister was wonderful too, Eliza Partridge, and Louisa Beeman. And you got the impression that people just loved Louisa Beeman. I mean, she's in the Eliza R. Snow diaries, the Patty Sessions diaries, and everyone remembered her with fondness. And so if we had to limit it to 3, you know, those come to my mind first, but there were a lot of others. Some of them, there weren't many documents, so I didn't really get to know that well. And the Lawrence sisters, someone asked me today earlier if there's any of the women who I really didn't like, and I thought, gee, that'd be kind of tactless for her if she's listening in. But like the Lawrence sisters, I really didn't get to know that well, and people didn't like them very much. But so I'm kind of stuck with the documents I have for them. But a lot of the other women were really wonderful people, came through really well in their writings. Lucy, her last name was Kimball. Who am I thinking? Lucy Walker Kimball. Lucy Walker Smith Kimball. It'd be fun to talk to her. A lot of women like that. Oh, Patty Sessions, you know. Gee, well, already I failed in your request to name only 3. You know. So I forgot to tell you, in the second book, I included only writings that the women themselves wrote. So there are not 33 chapters, there's 22 chapters. You know, so there's what is that, about 10 of these women who didn't leave any writings themselves. Sometimes we're able to document them through, you know, like the diary of a brother or sister, or something that appears in the Nauvoo Neighbor in Nauvoo or something like that. But we only have writings that I know of from those 22. Yes?
Are you satisfied from the historical record that Joseph had no offspring with any of these polyandrous or polygamous wives?
Oh yeah. Am I satisfied that Joseph Smith had no offspring from these polygamous wives? And this is opening up a whole new line of discussion. And again, how much do we have, like 3 hours here left? So I'll try to answer briefly. I just wrote an article that will appear in an anthology edited by Cheryl Bruno about early Mormon polygamy, and the question of the article is, were there eternity-only marriages in Nauvoo? And the short answer is, I don't believe so. I don't find any evidence for that. So I believe all of these marriages were for time and eternity, which usually includes offspring. Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, Smith Young, she, aside from this memoir I've talked about, she gave lots of talks later in her life, and she wrote letters. And in one of the things she wrote, she said, I know 3 of the children of Joseph Smith, and they were raised under other names. Okay, and so that is not absolute documentary, perfect history, but she herself, who was a plural wife of Joseph Smith, felt that there were children of Joseph Smith. Ebenezer Robinson said that there was a place in Iowa where the plural wives in Nauvoo would go and they would have babies. Okay, so Nauvoo was all. Did I hit a button here?
I ran out of batteries.
Oh. Nauvoo was all secret polygamy. Okay, there was no open polygamy. Men did not openly live with these secret plural wives as known plural wives. Polygamy was illegal under state law, and Joseph Smith was very sensitive to legal problems, situations that could cause him legal problems, as we know from his days in Kirtland and Missouri, in Nauvoo. And so his plural marriages were done under strict secrecy. He would often tell the wife, when he was proposing to her, the first thing, you promise not to tell anyone about this. It could mean, I could be in danger if you tell anyone. Please do not tell anyone. And so Emily Partridge, and just to show you how this worked, Emily Partridge and Eliza Partridge, they were both married to Joseph Smith, pretty close to, the same time, and neither knew that the other sister had married Joseph Smith. And their mother did not know that they had married Joseph Smith. They had kept it absolutely secret. And so, if there were children of Joseph Smith, they were absolutely secret. I don't know if we ought to get into the whole story of Sylvia Sessions.
Please do, she's my grandmother.
Really? Well, it'll take a little while. Okay, since you're her child, her descendant. So she, as well as her mother, Patty Sessions, they were both plural wives of Joseph Smith, and they were polyandrous wives of Joseph Smith. They were both married to other men at the same time they were married to Joseph Smith. And Sylvia Sessions has one of these complex marriage histories. She ended up married to, this will test my memory, maybe you can help me. So let's see if I can figure it out. Sylvia Sessions, then now Lyon, she married Windsor Lyon. Sylvia Sessions, Lyon, then she married Joseph Smith, and then she married Heber C. Kimball, all this while Windsor Lyon was alive. And then with Windsor Lyon, she had a daughter. She had a number of children who died, but she had a daughter named Josephine who survived. And so she was known as Josephine Lyon, later married someone named Fisher. John Fisher? Okay. And so at first, she did not go west. She stayed, her last marriage was, what was his name? Was the name Perry?
Clark, according to this.
Clark, that's right. I'm thinking of Patty Sessions' last husband was Perry. Yeah, it was Clark, Ezekiel Clark, right? Okay, and so and he was kind of a banker. He was kind of well-to-do, and so she stayed with him, and they lived part of the time in Iowa City. But eventually, she felt this urge to return to Zion, and so she left Clark and went back to Utah, and lived in the Bountiful area where her mother lived, and I have ancestors from there too. And okay, fast forward a little bit. So Sylvia Sessions is on her deathbed, and she calls Josephine to her deathbed and tells Josephine, "You are a child of Joseph Smith." And so Josephine didn't tell many people about this. She just something to think about. But later, they were collecting affidavits from these former plural wives of Joseph Smith, and they especially wanted a affidavit from Sylvia Sessions because she said she had had a child of Joseph Smith. And there was this controversy between the RLDS, Current Community of Christ Church, and our church, controversy between the sons of Joseph Smith and sons of Hiram Smith, like Joseph F. Smith. And so the Utah Mormons wanted to prove that Joseph Smith, these were real marriages, and so here's a child. that we have documented in this affidavit. And okay, fast forward a little bit more. In our time, in like the last decade, someone who's a scientist, 𝘐𝘯 𝘚𝘢, and he has tried to use scientific methods of documenting who the plural wives of Joseph Smith were. Now, to do it with Josephine is kind of problematic because it's not as easy to do it with a woman as it is for a man. So there's kind of a experimental aspect to this, but he went ahead and did it. And he feels that according to his evidence, Josephine was a child of 𝘠𝘯 not of Joseph Smith. Okay, I'm not a scientist. I don't know how to evaluate this. So, I'm provisionally accepting it, but I know that with science, as with history, often someone takes a position and then later on someone disagrees with it. So we'll see how it goes in the scientific, in the scientific way of dealing with history. So, but I'm provisionally accepting that she was a child of 𝘠𝘯 not of Joseph Smith. However, I still think that affidavit shows that Sylvia Sessions believed she was a daughter of Joseph Smith. Okay, so apparently she was having sexual relations both with Joseph Smith and with 𝘠𝘯 around the same time. Okay, so there's kind of the ins and outs of that story. So, do you accept? Do you have any comments on that as a descendant?
I donated DNA
Yeah.
as part of the study, and I just wondered if the scientist in question, who happens to be the coordinator of the church education system in Italy, if, not to impugn his scientific ability, but I wonder if he was persuaded by his position as an employee of the church and maybe had other goals in mind other than demonstrating that 𝘠𝘯 gave birth to Joseph's daughter. So
Yeah, this person who is
skeptical.
who is descendant of Sylvia Sessions and said that he contributed DNA, I guess, to this research done by 𝘐𝘯 𝘚𝘢, and so he said, again, probably you're not a scientist, right? But he knows that 𝘚𝘢 is he's one of the leaders of the church educational system in Italy. I've heard that, I've never actually met him, but I've heard that he wanted to work really hard to make sure that it was well documented and that people could examine his evidence and accept it. And so, as I say, I'm provisionally accepting it. But I feel like as a historian, I can go check someone's evidence and know how to evaluate it. With this, I can't. So, it's a very interesting very interesting problem in the history of polygamy. I'll tell you one little other detail. As I told you, I have ancestors in Bountiful, one of whom was named Joseph Hiram Grant. And maybe the second or third time I read that affidavit of Josephine Fisher, I looked at who actually witnessed it. And there was my great-great-grandfather, Joseph Hiram Grant, who's one of the people who signed it. So, our ancestors might have been friends. Yes. Did you raise your hand? Yeah, go ahead.
So, you mentioned that you weren't comfortable with a list of the wives, like you were with Brigham and Heber. So, can you tell a little bit about the process and how you got to the point where you were comfortable with the list of all the wives? Or
Yeah. And again, I'll probably give you a little more response than you want or need, but I found out that there was a list, somewhat documented list in Fawn Brody's book, No Man Knows My History. She did an appendix. And this is exactly, I think, what you need to do. If you're writing a history of a major church leader, you need an appendix. Talk about his, document his families. And if someone has plural wives, these are real wives of this man. There should be an appendix. I mean, there should be a paragraph at least for each of these wives. And there's many books that are, written by authors I think are really good authors, but they haven't done this. They haven't mentioned each of the plural wives of Joseph Smith, great book by Stan Kimball on Heber C. Kimball, and he had a good list of the plural wives of Heber C. Kimball, and but he didn't have it footnoted, and it's like, Mike Quinn did great research on Joseph Smith's plural wives, and you can read his list. He has a lot more than I do in the Mormon Hierarchy books, and those helped me. I used those. I used his list. It was very helpful. But they're not footnoted, darn it. And another list that I did use a lot was by Andrew Jensen that appeared, when did that appear? Was it like 1878 or something like that? And he was, a few years later, he became an assistant historian of the LDS Church. But he did an article in the Historical Record, which was a magazine he himself edited and wrote a lot of it. He did an article on plural marriage, focusing on Nauvoo, and he had a list of, what was it? Was it 27 or 28 plural wives of Joseph Smith? Okay, so when I discovered that was a big help. But again, it isn't footnoted. It's not, what I wanted was something written by a good historian who's working now and has access to current documents and is footnoted and so on and so on. So those were the, all of these lists helped me and I used them. But Fawn Brody's list, she used a lot of, one thing, it was out of date. I was writing in 1993, and when was that published? 1945 or something like that? Like half a century earlier. It was out of date. She did not have, in her defense, there were problems with her list, but in her defense, she did not have open archives to work with. So she used a lot of anti-Mormon writing that was late, that I did not find the source trustworthy. Another thing, there were problems, one specific problem, and this woman I told you about later, Elizabeth Davis Goldsmith, Brackenbury, Durfee, Smith-Lott, she had her as a wife under one name, and then she had her as a wife under another name. Okay, so in other words, it's like there were two women when actually that was the same woman. Okay, and again, I can't criticize her too much because it really is a challenge to keep track of these complex lives and complex marriages. And it took me a long time to figure out Sister Goldsmith was also Sister Brackenbury, and her maiden name was Elizabeth Davis. But anyway, there were major problems I felt with her list. At the same time, I really admire that she tried to document those plural wives in that appendix. Okay, so that's why I felt